Let's begin with a prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you, O Lord, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A few years ago, I was part of a Central Guys backpacking trip to Isle Royale. As the ferry docked on the island, it started to rain. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained. We hiked off in the rain. We took breaks, very short ones, in the rain. We arrived at our first campsite, and it was raining, and it kept raining. We got to know each other better standing under a simple blue tarp. Thanks for thinking of that, Art. We stood there shivering, and it was raining so hard that water would pool on the tarp, making it sag until one of us would push it up and out. We set up our tents under that tarp, trying to keep the insides of the tents dry as long as possible. And I remember wondering, would it rain like this the entire trip? This rain, will it ever end? Maybe you are asking the same question. At least you're not asking that question about this sermon. You can just hit fast forward. But seriously, about COVID-19, will it ever end? Will we ever return to normal? Or your job is difficult during this pandemic and you wonder, will it ever end? Or you find yourselves on the front line of working against racism. And while it feels good that there's a focus on this right now, the pushback is real, the problems continue, and you might find yourself wondering, will it ever end? How do we understand this time that we are in? How do we keep going? How do we live with courage and faith and live our best, most faithful life in this, the time that we have? We are in a series to explore how time is marked and remembered and celebrated and how difficult things are endured together. We'll be looking at stories of long periods of epic struggles told in the Bible. Several of these will be described as 40 days or 40 nights, or in this case, 40 days and 40 nights, a long time. Today, the beginning, if you will, to the Noah's Ark story, 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It is, of course, the setting for a story that is told and featured in children's Bibles and displayed on the walls and through hanging mobiles in children's nursery rooms. Cute little pairs of animals, all with smiles on their faces. Intended, I suppose, to bring comfort to those young infants. Which is, I believe, a bit odd, for the story is one of destruction. That the only way forward, God thinks, is by starting over. Creative destruction, perhaps, but destruction. To those of us turning the pages in the big, thick Bible, it all seems so soon after the stories about creation. Not too long after the wonderful in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. In that refrain day by day with each act of creation that God saw that it was good. It was all good. So good. It was the Garden of Eden. But then, soon after creation began, we begin to hear stories of how violence and evil entered that world. And like a cancerous growth where the bad cells multiply faster than the good ones and threaten the whole being, the violence and evil multiply. And God decides that enough is enough. If you or a loved one has been through a chemotherapy regimen, you know that the treatment and potential cure can be terribly difficult, that there will be losses and pain along the way. Yet you've come to agree that it is the best and only course of action. In this story, a radical treatment is necessary to stop this violence and evil from consuming everything. As the story tells it, God sets upon a course of action. A flood that wipes out all the evil in the world, leaving only a remnant behind for a new beginning, a best last chance at a fresh start. And so the rain begins, and it does not let up. Let's be clear about something. This isn't a scientific accounting. It's a theological story, a legend that's a part of what the HarperCollins Study Bible calls the primordial history that recounts the earliest generations of the world and humankind as background for the call of Abram in chapter 12, verse 1. Sometimes we read this in other stories from the Bible, like the account in the first 2 chapters of Genesis about creation, or this one about a flood of epic proportions being used. And we want to know, did it really happen that way? And we want to bring the tools of science to confirm or deny if the details are right. But that is, in my opinion, to miss the point. It would be like if I said to you right now, knock, knock. And if you don't think and wonder who's there, but instead, if you want to argue with me and say, listen, Dave, you just said those words, knock, knock, and there was not a noise at my door. Well, it was a joke. Let me use another comparison to help you see at least how I and many biblical and theological scholars understand the purpose of these early Genesis stories. So let me go back to my Isle Royal backpacking story. The details of how I have told and remembered the beginning of that backpacking trip on Isle Royal might not line up with scientific measurements. In my memory, it rained and rained and rained for the first 24 hours of that trip. In my memory, it might have been the wettest day ever on that island. That's how it felt. But the scientists among us now, and the many scientists who study that island, would probably raise a cynical eyebrow at my telling, wanting maybe to correct my details. You said 24 hours of solid rain. Try 15, Mr. Storyteller. We went back and looked at the records of 2016. And by the way, they might go on, it wasn't such an unusual amount of rain. On average, 12 days every year, or whatever, receive that much or more rainfall. But the backpacking story doesn't belong to those scientists. It's my story to tell. Though please feel free to ask Jeremy and Art and Ned and Derek what they remember about that trip as well. These stories from Genesis were never intended to fill a science textbook. They're theological stories to tell us about God and about goodness and evil and about our role as humans to be stewards for others and accountable to our calling. The story is not some dry recitation of facts, but a compelling story that hooks us, that gives us characters we can imagine, makes us want to keep the story moving. From the Garden of Eden in the beautiful creation to so much evil and violence that God is ready to be done with it, what will happen next? And we hear about Noah and the instructions to build an ark that will survive the flood. And we can imagine ourselves in that situation. What would the neighbors think as our garage and then the front yard are filled with wood and tools and this strange multi-level boat starts to take shape? In that sense of time, after the ark is completed, a 7-day warning before the rains begin to store up provisions and gather the animals, to make sure the phones are charged and there's plenty of food on hand, and there won't be any fresh meat. Hey, do you know why Noah didn't go fishing, by the way? He only had 2 worms. Thanks to Kira and Christy for editing out the groans in the background about another dad joke. But there is, I believe, in addition to some very serious theological points, a playfulness in this story that's intended as we read or listen. I think we're supposed to imagine Noah needing to give careful attention to the order that the animals process into the boat. Predators and prey in different compartments of the ark. Not all seats on this plane are identical. The giraffes will get plenty of leg and neck room. And let's put the lions over on that side and the zebras on that side. As the prayer says, lead us not into temptation. And so Noah and his family entered the ark along with animals of every species to wait for the rains to end and the floods to subside and for a chance to start over. It's going to be a long boat ride for them. Can you imagine the smells, the gloom? Maybe there was a moment of elation after the rains have started and the flooding is felt, and that wooden ark actually starts rising off the front yard, and those neighbors who taunted them watch it become seaworthy and actually sail off safely. But there must have been some very real sadness that emerged as well as the floods took on power and destruction. Last Sunday, many of us were out in the church parking lot. It was great to be together, but I felt a bit guilty because it was such a beautiful day. My head was already into this passage of a flood of epic proportions, and there were forest fires raging throughout the western parts of our country and another hurricane forecast to make landfall. A simple glance at the news gave witness to terrible acts of destruction. And it felt almost unfair that we were having such a beautiful afternoon in St. Paul, standing out in the church parking lot. As we read this story today, I think it's absolutely right to think about climate change in our time. We know what is causing such rapid warming. We know the impact of more dangerous storms, droughts, famines, and relocations. The question is, do we have the will within us to envision a better way, to see change as both necessary and opportune? Stories help us to imagine new possibilities, new beginnings. The story of Noah's Ark uses humor to make some very serious theological points. That God is working for the health of the world, and that God is sad over the increase of evil and violence. That there's a human responsibility to tend to creation and preserve species. That God desires real change, and sometimes we are offered second chances. Within the story is both warning and promise. The warning is that if we are faithful, we have a responsibility to be on the side of goodness in a world in which there is too much violence and evil. And the promise that God will help us to endure even when the waters rise. And so the rains begin. Will it ever end? And how will we emerge from that ark when the floods are over? And what can we do today to be faithful? Remember that backpacking trip I was telling you about? It did stop raining, and the sun came out, and we dried out our tents and gear on the rocks of that beautiful Greenstone Ridge Trail during breaks. And having experienced all that rain together, we were brought closer together, more ready to enjoy life. After that long day of rain, the sunshine that followed us on the other parts of that trip were all the more glorious because of it. Amen.